Kink shaming. Why do people do it? And how can you stop doing it? Now, I use the word kink shaming because it is a pretty broad term, but I think it needs to be more inclusive of all kinds of shaming, right? Like any kind of pleasure shaming or physical needs shaming or preferences shaming. Because if we call it kink shaming, sometimes it implies just a very narrow, specific set of activities and sexual experiences, whereas these principles apply to all kinds of things that have nothing to do with BDSM or anything kind of fringe. It can be anyone can experience kink shaming, even if they're not kinky. Anyways, kink shaming prevents authenticity from your partner. Let's say you kink shame your partner. If they come to you and say like, hey, I kind of want to try this thing. I know it's a little unusual, or hear me out. I know this is kind of weird, but, and they share something, they're vulnerable with you and they reveal to you their desires or their interests. And that's very vulnerable, right? It's very exposing. There's a risk that they could experience judgment or encounter negative reactions from you. And if you react negatively and kink shame them in some way by saying like, oh, that's gross, or wow, why the hell do you like that? Or, oh my God, I could never do that. Like these kinds of reactions essentially tell your partner that you are not a safe place for them to be themselves, to be authentic. You are shutting down their own authentic self-expression. You are preventing intimacy with them. You are showing them that there is not emotional safety in the relationship or the partnership, even if you're not in an official relationship. So what you're doing is basically reinforcing judgment against them and reinforcing shame and further creating disconnection between you and your partner. So why burst somebody's bubble, right? Like if it's not harming anyone, if it's safe, sane, and consensual, these are like the pillars of sexual practices, even if they're fringe, then who's it really harming? If it's not your cup of tea, that's okay. So when people are kink shaming, it implies that there's something wrong or harmful about the other person's interests or preferences, or just them as a person, as a whole. It comes from, it's a very othering perspective, right? Like, oh, there's me and the people like me and we are normal and we are okay and we are good. And there are people who are not like me and they are different and strange and dangerous and sick or messed up in some way, right? This comes from an extrapolation of meaning based on assumptions and biases and a lack of education, to be completely honest. People who don't understand kinks or fringe sexual activities are way more likely to judge them because they don't understand them. And it's a classic human thing to fear what we don't understand, to reject the things that are different, right? So there's actually no data that shows that people who are kinky or have fringe sexual interests have harmful, negative personality traits, mental illnesses, tendencies for violence or trauma in their history. So there's no correlation there. These assumptions are completely baseless. So moving forward with that knowledge, do you think differently about kinks or unusual sexual interests or fantasies that other people might bring to you? Why do people kink shame in the first place? Well, I have a lot of theories, and it has to do with not being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes, not having the emotional maturity to be able to relate to someone else and to understand, oh, people are different from me, and that's okay. It takes a lot of security within yourself and confidence and having good moral fortitude to be able to live and let live, right? If they're not harming anybody, if it's safe, sane, and consensual, why not live and let live, right? And it comes from a discomfort or, uneasiness with things and people who are different, who are strange, things you're not familiar with, right? And that discomfort is something that you are unable, if you're a kink shaming person, to keep inside. People who have the emotional maturity and self-regulating tools emotionally are able to keep that inside and able to not project their judgment and assumptions and shaming onto others, basically. So it shows a lack of self-acceptance when you judge other people, when you shame and reject and say, oh, your thing is not my thing, and my thing is the right thing, is the good thing, is the acceptable thing. That shows that on some level, you're not accepting of yourself. if you judge others, you've probably been self-judging yourself quite a bit. And it's not always obvious because you can't see the forest for the trees. You're inside your own head, and so you may not recognize when you're self-judging. But what if you had that kink? What if you were the one who had the weird interest that your partner brought to you? Can you imagine yourself bringing that to someone else, opening yourself up for criticism, potential judgment, or rejection? And how does that feel, right? Would you think to yourself like, oh my God, if I had a foot fetish, I would be so weird. I would be messed up. Like, oh, I would bring myself to therapy and try to get rid of that, right? That's self-judgment. If you can't imagine yourself, even if you know it's not your cup of tea, if you can't do that mental exercise, that hypothetical thought experiment, and you judge yourself for that, that shows that you have a lack of acceptance for your own interests. Are there some things perhaps in your erotic psyche that you are afraid to share with people, or that you are embarrassed to say out loud, even to your partner, the person you share your most innermost thoughts and feelings and intimate beliefs with? That says a lot. That indicates some self-judgment and some self-shame. There's also a factor at play here that we live in a puritanical society here in the United States, right? It's a very sexually repressive culture, and it's been ingrained for hundreds, if not thousands of years historically where this all comes from. And therefore, it creates a very narrow norm for what's okay and acceptable and healthy and allowable, and everything outside that narrow norm is like not okay, not healthy, don't do that. Like, it is heavily judged, heavily scrutinized, and people who are into it are ostracized. They're pushed to the edges of society, they're freaks, they're not trustworthy, they're not safe, don't hang out with them, right? And so when we have this very narrow view of what's acceptable sexually, we reject and ostracize all these other people who have totally normal interests. I mean, normal as in like natural. They're not harmful. They don't come from a broken place necessarily. And it's a narrowing of the definition of what sex can be and what sexuality and eroticism can be. So we come from a very narrow context. That's a big part of it. How do we not kink shame? This is a skill you need to learn. If you're going to be a healthy, sexually active adult in the world and interact with people who are inevitably going to be different from you on some level, in some way, you need to be able to show up in a emotionally safe way, in an emotionally regulated and mature way, in order to bring your best self and show respect to people, even if you don't know them very well, or even if you've been partners with them for 20 years. It's important to show up in this way because it shows your own integrity, right? It shows your own maturity. So how do we prevent this? Well, you don't have to like what other people like. You don't have to be into what they're into. When they bring to you or bring up or mention an interest they have, remember, it's not about you. They're not asking you to do it necessarily. They're not asking you to like it as much as they like it. They're not asking for your full endorsement, like, woo, I love it, I'm gung-ho. Like, no. They're not. They're just expressing themselves to you. So don't make it about you. You have your own interests and you know what they are, and this is someone else's interest, and now you're discovering what they are, right? Also, practice acceptance. Look at the other person and think to yourself, how can I not judge them in this moment? How can I operate on the golden rule? Treat others as you want to be treated, right? So if you don't want to be rejected and shamed and mocked and ridiculed and judged and things like that for your interests, whether they're fringe or not, think of a normal interest you have, like, oh, you like back massages, right? Pretty common thing, not a fringe thing. If you brought that to someone else, a potential partner or an existing partner, said, hey, I would really love a back rub, and they were like, who are you? What are you? Oh my God. Wow. Would you want that reaction? That's terrible, right? So you're like, okay, how can I not do that to other people? Like, I don't want to be that person in this moment. So show up as somebody better. Thirdly, get curious. This is a really useful tip all across the board when it comes to sexual topics, but if you are presented with a kink you are unfamiliar with, or one that maybe causes some ickiness, some disgust inside of you in some way, where you're like, ooh, at first, or you raise an eyebrow and are like, what the hell is that all about? First of all, just get curious. Ask them questions. Say, that's really interesting. I've never heard of that. Can you tell me more about that? Or, oh wow, I never knew that about you. Where does that come from? What is it about you that attracts you to that kink? Or what is it about that kink or activity or preference that lights you up? What in your psyche, in your mind, how does it turn you on? And just be interested in their answer. Don't judge it. Just ask questions that are open-ended, and do not react with judgment. It brings me to my next point, and this might be the most important one. Do not be rude. Withhold your visceral reaction. If you have that icky, gross feeling inside and you notice it coming up, you have the ability to control your facial expressions, right? You have the ability to control what words come out of your mouth. So choose to control them. Just, okay, all right, that's weird. Like, you can acknowledge that feeling in your body and accept it. Be like, oh wow, that really prickled me, or that made me feel strange. And like, you can unpack that later. But in the moment, don't fucking show it. Don't make the other person feel bad by your like your reaction. That's like this gut, knee-jerk reaction. It doesn't have to be that way. I believe in you that you can withhold that. As long, again, as it's safe, sane, and consensual, you can react in a mature and kind, compassionate way. Next, try to react in a neutral way. So I'm not just saying withhold your reaction, but react still. Show them like, oh, I hear you. Interesting. Oh, wow, I've never heard of that. What about what I just said was judgmental? It wasn't pro or con. It wasn't for or against. It was purely neutral, right? So use a neutral tone of voice, neutral facial expressions, neutral body language, and that will help the other person feel safer and seen and not judged, because they know something is off sometimes. They know that maybe you're going to be a judgmental person, so they're like watching for your reaction. They know that this information is maybe a little different or fringe or unusual, and that it can affect people and they may react strongly. And when they see you not react strongly, they may feel relieved and relaxed and safer and able to speak more honestly about why they're bringing this to you in the first place. Next, remember that it's all relative, right? Kinks, interests, sexual preferences, what's normal to one person is wild and way out there to another, and vice versa. You may think that you're totally vanilla and you have no strange interests whatsoever, but like maybe there's some little fantasy in the corner of your head that's popped in there at some point that is normal to you, is totally within the bounds of what you find acceptable and not judgment worthy. But if you were to bring that to somebody else who's very different from you, they might find that very strange and they may have some reaction about it. So as much as you may think you're like the normal and like totally clean person, whatever, it really is all relative. One man's trash is another man's treasure. One man's ice cream is another man's liver. I don't know. It's all a matter of preference, right? Everyone has different tastes. And lastly, try to celebrate the differences in the world. Humanity is incredibly diverse and complex, and so are our erotic imaginations and our interests. And this is a beautiful thing. This is great. Again, as long as it's safe, sane, and consensual, like, let's focus on the fact that, wow, humanity and our erotic imaginations and our sexual expressions are so different and so all over the board. What an amazing mix and diversity, and that keeps things interesting, right? If we were all the same and liked all the same things, like, doesn't that kind of sound boring? Isn't that very predictable? Isn't that very unimaginative? People are very creative, and everybody's got a very unique set of interests and puzzle pieces and wirings that make them who they are. So celebrate that. Find it interesting. Be fascinated and get curious. All right, so keep these things in mind the next time that someone brings to you an interest that you find a little strange or a little unusual or kind of gross maybe, or not your thing, and vice versa. If you bring these things to someone else, watch for the way that they react. You might have to show them this video and be like, hey, the way you reacted was like not very compassionate, and I would really like you to be able to hold space for my experience and my interests and just hear me out without judgment. Here's how you can do that. Hope this is helpful.